Hi guys. The first section we're going to talk about for this is chapter 3, is physical growth and development in infancy. Okay. So we want to talk about the patterns of growth. So first of all, growth happens in cephalocaudal pattern. So you can see the sequence of which growth happens starts from the top. Okay, so you can see right here with these really bad drawings for infants and fetus and so on are they're just a little odd. But this is supposed to be a 2-month fetus, and then 4-month fetus, and then this is supposed to be an infant, so at birth. But the physical growth begins in the head, and the growth occurs down, right? So from head to tail. So that's something that you need to remember. The growth happens from the head to the tail. So the differentiation of features work their way down. But growth also happens in a proximodistal pattern. So the sequence occurs from the center towards the extremities, right? So the trunk area in the center towards like the fingers and the toes and such. So here it says near to far, outward from the central axis of the body. For the height and weight, so the average newborn is 20 inches long and weighs 7.5 pounds. My youngest son was about that, so he weighed 7 pounds, 7 pounds 12 ounces, and he was about 20 inches long. My oldest son was heavier than that, so he was a little bit longer and he weighed 8 pounds 1 ounce, but that's the typical average newborn. But at first, newborns lose weight. They have to adjust to feeding. Basically, the whole family dynamic has to adjust to this baby eating every couple of hours. So, and the infant has to adjust to eating versus being fed through just being in the mother's tummy, right? So, in their first year, they grow quite quickly, from about 3/4 of an inch per month. This obviously there is individual differences here, but by 2 years, they weigh between 26 and 32 pounds, and they're about 32 to 35 inches tall. And again, that's one of those. That's the average, so we're talking right in the middle. This can vary. As far as the brain goes, there's a lot of development that continues after birth throughout infancy and even later. So later on, we'll learn that especially like the frontal lobe, like where executive function and stuff occurs, happens like develops a lot during adolescent period. But so that your brain's not fully developed when you're born. So at birth, your brain weighs about 25% of its adult weight. But by 2 years, it weighs about 75% of its adult weight. And brain areas do not develop all in a similar way as far as their maturity. So that's something to think about, like why would certain parts of the brain develop more quickly, mature more quickly than other parts. You guys should have read in your text in chapter 3 about shaken baby syndrome. This is caused from brain swelling and hemorrhaging. Now, there's different ways that doctors have been able to measure and measure the brain's development, and these are some of the ways. Now, if you can remember right, they're like the MRI. If you've ever had an MRI, during an MRI, you have to be very, very still. Moving too much during the MRI will make the images come out horribly, and you have to redo it. So this is not, some of these methods aren't exactly perfect for infants, because an infant doesn't necessarily understand or cannot physically sit still for as long as necessary. But one of the ways, this is a video I'm hoping that works through on here, but it is, if it doesn't work on here, it is in the PowerPoint, which I want you to look at on the PowerPoint page on your class site. But this is an EEG. Let's see if I can play it. Maybe I can, oh, there we go. I don't know if there's any sound. But this is a person putting an EEG on a baby. An EEG, if you have one as an adult, I've had an EEG before for sleep studies to measure brain waves, but they're taking these little electrodes and putting them all over your scalp. Now, this is a net, so the baby it's like a little hat that can be put on the infant, and they're adjusting where the markers are going. As an adult, they put mine on. It wasn't a hat. It was more like like little electrodes they put on specific spots. So I had fewer of them, but they were put in very specific positions with some sort of adhesive type gel. I'm not sure if they have how much adhesive they would have on this infant, but you can see that putting it on this infant this way is a lot more likely that it's going to stay in the same spot. Whereas if there were separate cords where the infant could pull on, because you can see the infant is wanting to grab a hold of things, they will do that, especially to like necklaces or any kind of strings hanging down, or your hair if your hair hangs down. So having this cap that is attached with several different ways, you can see it's strapping underneath the baby's chin, it's going to stay still. Okay, moving on, you can watch the rest of that on your own. So thinking of mapping the brain, there's the forebrain, includes the cerebral cortex and several layers beneath it. So the cerebral cortex covers the brain like a wrinkled cap. If you've seen images of the brain, you can see the wrinkly part of the brain on the outside, and that's the cerebral cortex. So there's 4 lobes: frontal, temporal, parietal, and occipital lobe. Lateralization is the specialization of function in one hemisphere versus the other. So the brain has, like, when you look at it from the front view, there's like 2 halves. Right here is a diagram of the different lobes. So your frontal lobe, your temporal lobe. I remember this more like as near your ears. The occipital lobe in the back of your head, and the parietal lobe. So those are really important to know. Just these different lobes of the brain, and picture this being on both sides. So there's 2 different hemispheres and 4 different lobes. All right, so a neuron is a nerve cell that handles information processing. So it has an axon and dendrite fibers. The myelin sheath is a layer of fat that encases many axons, but it provides insulation, but also it helps electrical signals travel faster. So it gets more, as the brain grows, it gets more efficient. Neurotransmitters are chemicals in the brain, and synapses are the tiny gaps between the neurons. So as you can see, this is the myelin sheath, and that develops to help versus the signal traveling slowly. This myelinating sheath helps it to travel quickly. This is where it would be connecting to the next neuron, right? So here's dendrites, the nucleus, the axon. If you haven't taken neuroscience yet, hopefully you will, but you learn all different sorts of information about neurons. So again, myelination is the process of encasing axons with fat cells. Begins prenatally, but continues throughout childhood and adolescence. Okay, so the signals aren't as efficient as they should be throughout this whole entire period. The pace of myelination varies in different areas of the brain, and the connectivity between the neurons increases, new dendrites grow, and new neural pathways are created. So, and the more these pathways are used, the better they will be in memory. So as the connections become stronger and survive, unused ones are replaced by synaptic pruning. So that's why some things aren't remembered. Okay, so as these, there's things that you don't realize is something that you just know how to do, like walking. At first you don't know how to walk. Infants have that reflex of picking up their feet and trying, as you're holding them up and making that walking motion. But the more they do it, the better they get, the more efficient they get, and the stronger the pathway is. If they stopped doing it, it would stop working, right? But that's not how infants are drawn to looking for things and being autonomous and being independent. So they grab things, pull themselves up, and that's how children learn to walk. And this is similar to just doing math. The more you do it, the better you'll be, the more this connection becomes stronger, and the more likely it is to survive and not be pruned away. Blooming and pruning can vary by brain region, so heredity and environment also influence this timing and course. So genes direct how the brain establishes basic wiring patterns before birth. After birth, environmental experiences guide the brain's development. So infants whose caregivers expose them to a variety of stimuli are most likely to develop to their full potential. However, being born into an environment that is not conducive to helping stimulate these different areas of the brain, they're less likely to develop. So children in deprived environments may have depressed brain activity. So consider really low socioeconomic status areas. Consider families where the parents are absent or possibly drug addicts or just not around or abusive. This impacts how the brain develops. So these children who are born into abusive families learn certain things. Being exposed to these things and not being exposed to any other way could be extremely harmful. Being exposed to these things can also, if they have a good influence, that good influence could also it also impacts the way these other experiences impact brain development, if that makes sense. So brain develops or demonstrates both flexibility and resilience to profusion of neuron connections. So the neuroconstructionist view is a biological processes and environmental conditions influence the brain's development. The brain has plasticity and is context dependent. Development of the brain and the child's cognitive development are closely linked. For sleep, newborns require a lot of sleep. So as a new parent, when you bring your child home, sometimes I know there was times when I was like, oh, I wish he would just wake up so I can see him because I want to see his eyes open and I want to snuggle with him. But this is normal. Newborns typically require a lot of sleep. But problematically, these children are also nighttime waking. So that's very, very common, meaning they don't sleep through the night. By 6 months, the majority sleep through the night. But 6 months is a very long time as a new parent. You are adjusting. You went from being able to sleep, especially for new parents, as far as never had a child, never had that experience, going from that to being woken up every single night and needing to feed your child, needing to change your child, or somehow try to get them to go back to sleep, to learn to sleep through the night. It's very difficult, and I called this phase my zombie phase for 6 months of both of my kids' lives, because they would continuously wake up in the middle of the night. It was very difficult. REM sleep, you should all know this from Psych 100 as rapid eye movement sleep. Infants spend about half of their sleep time in REM sleep. So often the brain sleep cycle with REM often begins the sleep cycle with REM sleep rather than non-REM sleep, which is very different to what we as adults experience in sleep patterns. It may promote infant brain development. If you remember right from Psych 100, REM sleep, the brain waves are much more active than the other sleep stages. It's more, it looks closer to being awake. When you look at brainwave from awake and brainwave in these different sleep stages. Sudden infant death syndrome occurs when an infant stops breathing at night, usually. Suddenly dies without any apparent cause, and this is the highest cause of infant death in the United States. And I found this video of this family who had lost their son to sudden infant death syndrome. Let's see if I can play it.
We just left our first ever appointment with this pregnancy. I just discovered that I'm 17 weeks and we are having
twins.
Like, what? We've been waiting for the day these babies will get out of my belly. We're so ready to meet our babies. I'm just thinking, like, in a few hours I'll have 2 babies right here. I'm so ready.
So y'all, I think it's time. You ready for that milk already?
Plug it in, plug it in.
You got the thing on his nose. We got the clutch, the passes. We wasn't playing no game. Alright, y'all, we're gonna switch. And we're gonna see how long it takes. Fussy box. We'll start fussing. It's gonna be all nice and sleep. Cool.
Oh, CJ want to get in, CJ.
CJ said, don't leave me out, though. Don't leave me out, though. Yeah, get. Okay.
Remember CJ say what's up to the Divas? Say what's up, oh, you smiling. Aw. Y'all, he putting on because he wouldn't be smiling if daddy wasn't holding him.
Alright, CJ ain't having it. Hold on, Maya, hold on, back up. You gotta back up, Maya. He ain't having it. We tried.
Calm down, CJ. It ain't that deep. Just calm down, okay? We're just trying to snap a couple pics, and then you can get back, okay? All right, CJ? Can you do that for mommy, please? All right, sweetie. Thank you. Hey, what's going on with your sister? Why she crying? Huh? You gonna talk to her? Huh? Why are you looking like you getting ready to go? Give me that Pepsi.
She just looking like, man, if you don't give me that milk.
You don't need that Pepsi. Hey, handsome. Hey, handsome. That's my baby. That's mommy baby. Yeah, say I'm okay. I just need somebody to talk to me. I just gotta be talked to all day, every day.
So as you could see, CJ was a very cared for and loved kid. He had two sisters, and he died suddenly in his sleep. SIDS is more likely to occur when an infant is placed on their stomach or side. Due to maternal smoking or infants passively exposed to cigarette smoke. When infants are formula fed rather than breastfed. If infants have abnormal brainstem functioning involving serotonin. In low birth weight infants. In African American and Eskimo infants. When infants don't use a pacifier when they go to sleep. When infants sleep in a bedroom without a fan. These are factors that have been shown to relate to SIDS death. And CJ was an African American infant. They did not mention whether he was low birth weight, but he didn't appear to be he didn't appear to be extremely low birth weight. And he did use a pacifier, so we saw that. So there are very many reasons why SIDS happens, but it's not something that these parents would have been neglectful or anything like that. It just happened to them. Breast versus bottle feeding. So human milk or formula is an appropriate source of nutrients and energy for the first 4 to 6 months of life. Breastfeeding is better for both the baby and the mother's health. There are many benefits to breastfeeding. Appropriate weight gain, lower risk of child obesity, fewer gastrointestinal infections, fewer respiratory tract infections. There's no evidence of benefits in cognitive development or cardiovascular functioning. There is a breastfeeding video that kind of shows how mothers breastfeed and how help the baby latch on. Um, but I didn't want to show that. I wasn't sure how offensive that would be for you guys to watch. So I thought I would leave the link and give you the choice to yourself to watch it or not. I had both of my sons, and both I actually bottle fed. I had worked in a factory at that time. I was afraid that the fiberglass that I worked with this material where you sanded these car parts, and the dust from that I was afraid was had got into my skin and my pores, and would be passed on due to that. So I opted for bottle feeding, and both of my kids had gastrointestinal intestinal problems. Um, Neither one had um, obesity problems, but they both ended up having to be put on soy formula because they repeatedly threw up their formula. Our youngest actually lost a lot of weight, more weight than he was supposed to have for a normal infant weight. Um, and we had to have him um, do some testing because they weren't sure why he was throwing up so much formula. So for the mother, there are some benefits to breastfeeding, which is lower incidence of breast cancer and reduction in ovarian cancer. And it says a small increase in intelligence. That I thought that was interesting. But mother should not breastfeed if she has HIV or other infections that are passed through breast milk, has active tuberculosis, or is taking any drugs. These things, the mother's nutrition, the mother's diet, and substances are passed on through breast milk. And finally, nutritional needs. So, U.S. parents feed babies too few fruits and vegetables and too much junk food. I know it's very hard even for adults to stick to a very healthy diet due to how productive we feel like we need to be. So convenient foods are typically used, and there are very few options at a lot of cheaper fast food places for healthy foods that you can eat while on the go, while driving, etc. It's much easier to just to get a burger and fries because those you can eat as you drive, and that is a sad reality that we have. Um, but parents pass these types of behaviors, their own behaviors, on to their children, and sometimes it is difficult for some families to afford a healthy diet for their family or their children. Adequate early nutrition, though, is very important for the aspect of healthy development. And this doesn't necessarily imagine much lower SES families who, even like I mentioned before, some parents may be addicted to drugs. And what do these families use their money for? Drugs. They are addicts. Many times they might buy the cheapest possible food that they can find for their family instead of the most healthy for their children, so they can have more money to satisfy their addictions. And to them, they may not be educated enough to understand how much this impacts their child. This is just how this development works. If you guys have any questions, comments, or concerns, please let me know. The next section we will talk about is motor development.